When people think about the foundation of the American economic system, they likely think it was the work of but one man, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. But Hamilton was not the first financier of the fledgling new republic, and he did not lead the nation's economy through the Revolutionary War. That distinction belongs to today's protagonist, the first and only United States Superintendent of Finance, Robert Morris. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. Robert Morris was born in Liverpool, England on January 20th, 1734, into a wealthy family. His mother died when he was only 2, and he was raised by his maternal grandmother in England while his father, Robert Morris Sr., built a name for himself as a successful merchant. At the age of 14, Robert journeyed across the Atlantic to join his father in Maryland. Shortly after arriving, he received his only formal education, being tutored by Reverend William Gordon for about a year. Morris, however, got bored living with his father, so he was sent to live with his father's friend, a Mr. Greenway in Philadelphia. A knack for business must have run in the family, as Robert began working for the firm Charles Willing and Company by helping them expand into the Caribbean. When Charles Willing died, Thomas, his son, offered Morris a partnership. In 1757, the company, rebranded Willing, Morris and Company, sent ships worldwide to seek out trading partners. Company ships traveled across the world to Spanish Cuba, Italy, India, the Levant, and Spain. Not only did Morris make a great deal of money from these ventures, but he also cultivated successful business relationships. These relationships would serve him well during the Revolution. During the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, Willing, Morris and Company sought to join the transatlantic slave trade. As a lack of indentured servants, people contracted to work without salary for a set time, created a labor shortage. However, this venture was unsuccessful, with the company taking a loss and quickly returning to transporting non-human commodities. Morris would also, throughout his life, own several slaves that he kept at his home. Morris was involved in the colonial resistance early on, when British authorities attempted to create badly needed revenue to pay off the debts of the 7 Years' War. Morris led a rowdy street protest against the Stamp Act. Morris and his business partner were also instrumental in organizing the first non-importation agreement in the nation in 1769. This agreement effectively ended the slave trade in Philadelphia. The very same year, Morris married Mary White. They'd go on to have 7 children together. Before we begin discussing the Revolutionary War, it'd be helpful to have a sense of Morris's personality. According to his biographer, Charles Rapolli, Morris had a very down-to-earth demeanor. Quote, he seemed to have that sort of gregarious, common touch. He could easily engage in conversations with the common dockhand and his fellow merchants and traders. By the time the first shots were fired across Lexington Green, Morris was undoubtedly the wealthiest man in the colonies. Morris immediately began purchasing gunpowder and weapons to arm the Pennsylvania militia, while also serving on the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety. Committees of safety were shadow governments that sprang up in the colonies, supplanting royal officials by issuing laws, enacting policies, and issuing regulations. These interim governments functioned until the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Due to his wealth and connections, as well as his work on the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety, Morris was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly and, as a delegate, attended the Second Continental Congress. Morris was against war with Britain. Yes, he had procured munitions for the militia, but he did so to deter the British from further aggression. He hoped the threat of violent rebellion would force the British to negotiate. He feared that the colonies were unprepared for self-governance, could not militarily defeat the British, and also voiced concerns about domestic security. Morris's worries went unheard. On July 2nd, 1776, when Congress was voting on the Declaration of Independence, he left the room, so the vote appeared unanimous. He did, however, sign the document on August 2nd, saying that it was, quote, the duty of every individual to act his part in whatever station his country may call him to in hours of difficulty, danger, and distress. During the first few years of the Revolution, he served on several congressional committees, such as the Committee of Correspondence, which managed foreign affairs, and the Marine Committee, which oversaw the colonial navy. Throughout this time, in a semi-official capacity, Morris began supplying the Continental Army with food, weapons, clothes, blankets, and other necessities. He resigned from Congress in 1778 to focus on his business since he was, by all accounts, the largest supplier of the Continental Army. He leveraged the business relationships he had grown over the years to find suppliers who were still willing to sell to the colonies. While away from Congress, he served in the Pennsylvania Assembly, sweeping aside at least one charge of corruption from, among others, Thomas Paine, the author of the pro-revolutionary pamphlet Common Sense. Accusations of corruption, though unfounded, would continue to plague Morris throughout and after the Revolution. By 1781, the country was broke. The army couldn't be paid. Worse still, the states often ignored congressional requests for funds to supply and equip the Continental Army, even as Washington and members of Congress pleaded with the states about the dire condition of the troops. Unless they could directly see the benefit of funding the Army, most states refused to do so. And the Army was in truly abysmal straits, relying on forced requisitions to survive. Washington summarized the situation to John Jay, a friend and member of Congress, in a letter, saying, quote, a wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions. Congress could not force the states to raise funds for the Army. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could not levy taxes or regulate interstate commerce. Even though most of the congressional and military leadership wished for a stronger national government, their hands were tied. Changing the Articles of Confederation required the unanimous consent of all 13 states, and consent was not forthcoming. With total financial collapse looming, Congress asked Morris to serve as the first Superintendent of Finance to stabilize the economy and fund the war. Morris was reluctant. He still doubted the colony's ability to win the war. He nonetheless agreed to serve after fellow Philadelphian Benjamin Franklin convinced him to do his duty to his nation. Morris took up the mantle on June 27, 1781. He immediately threw himself into his new post. He slashed government spending and sought foreign credit to finance the military, getting significant financial support from the French. He mainly made up the remaining deficit from fundraising efforts through his friend and advisor, Haym Salomon, or out of his own pockets. At the same time, Morris also was the United States Agent of Marine, running the small colonial navy and refitting many of his merchant ships into privateers. He founded the first national bank of the U.S., the Bank of North America, to lend money to the national government and issue a common currency. At the time, each state was circulating its own currency, exacerbating the financial woes of the new nation. While the bank got off the ground, Morris began issuing his infamous Morris Notes, essentially currency backed by his own personal fortune to buy supplies and pay the troops, this to mixed effect. In lieu of other funding sources, Morris and his friend Salomon personally financed the Yorktown campaign that culminated in the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and the British Army. But Morris knew such temporary solutions, like the bank and the Morris notes, wouldn't work in the long term, and he couldn't afford to keep paying and supplying the army himself. Congress needed a permanent source of revenue. To try and fix this problem, Morris embarked on his most ambitious endeavor to develop a new national tariff that imposed a 5% tax on all imported goods. It would also be, as it turned out, his biggest failure. As we saw earlier, under the Articles of Confederation, Morris needed all 13 states to agree to this massive expansion of the national government. Morris convinced 12 of the 13 states to go along with his proposal, but Rhode Island refused. Virginia then also pulled out of the deal. Despite his best efforts, Congress and the Revolution would remain divided and, more importantly, broke. The failure of Morris's tax proposal stung. It also made clear the limitations of the Confederation government. How could Congress conduct war or do anything if they couldn't raise money? The fate of the import tariff also highlights the deep-seated regionalism that still pervaded the minds of many of Morris's fellow citizens. By this time, the French loans Morris and Franklin secured began drying up, and France was unwilling to provide more, and the states were more hesitant than ever. Morris hadn't been paying the army since early 1782, hoping his tax amendment would give Congress the money needed to pay them itself. When that fell through, Morris, who had already paid the soldiers about $800,000, couldn't get Congress to help. He and his associates tried to force their hand. It's believed Morris, his deputy governor Morris, no relation, and Alexander Hamilton introduced an anonymous letter at the main army camp in Newburgh, New York, in an attempt to foment a military uprising in early 1783. The soldiers, understandably, were receptive to this plan. Many of them had become bankrupt, fighting for the American cause, and they would be imprisoned as soon as they left the army. Yes, up until about 1850, in many U.S. states, you could be thrown in prison if you failed to pay your debts. So the soldiers wanted their money, and Morris wanted Congress to pay them. Regardless of Morris's or anyone else's intent, any threat of insurrection was ended when Washington appealed directly to his officers and men to remain loyal to Congress. In reality, the men were more loyal to Washington than to Congress, but the Newburgh controversy was over. By this point, Morris was disillusioned with it all, and he wasn't the only one. Benjamin Franklin, writing to Morris in December 1783, railed against the people's reluctance to pay taxes. The remissness of our people in paying taxes is highly blamable. The unwillingness to pay them is still more so. All property, indeed, except the savage's temporary cabin, his bow, his match coat, and other little acquisitions, absolutely necessary for his subsistence, seems to me to be the creature of public convention. Hence, the public has the right of regulating descents and all other conveyances of property, and even of limiting the quantity and the uses of it. All the property that is necessary to a man for the conservation of the individual and the propagation of the species is his natural right, which none can justly deprive him of. But all property superfluous to such purposes is the property of the public. After another year enacting what little financial reforms he could, Morris resigned from all his posts on November 1st, 1784, and returned to Pennsylvania to focus on business. He returned to public life in 1787 as the first speaker at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. During his inaugural speech, he nominated Washington as chairman of the convention. This passed by unanimous vote. After the first day, Morris mostly kept to himself and rarely spoke, though he was present at every session. Morris signed the final draft, which addressed many of his concerns. The new document granted Congress the ability to levy taxes and collect tariffs, for example. Morris and his political allies ensured that Pennsylvania would ratify the new Constitution. Morris is only one of two people, Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman being the other, to have signed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution. After the convention, Morris declined Washington's offer to serve as the first Secretary of the Treasury, recommending instead his friend and ally, Alexander Hamilton, to the post. Many of Hamilton's policies, in fact, closely mirrored Robert Morris's earlier attempted reforms. He served as a United States Senator from Pennsylvania from 1789 to 1795. Throughout this time, his personal fortune, which had remained relatively intact during the war through trade with French and Spanish Caribbean colonies and privateering, slowly declined. He poured his wealth into land speculation, eventually owning about half of western New York. When what Rapoli calls America's first housing bubble burst, Morris, the financier, found himself bankrupt. He was thrown into debtor's prison, where he'd remain for 3.5 years, until the Bankruptcy Act of 1800 freed him. Nonetheless, he was still destitute, owing a staggering $2,948,711.11. He and his wife lived quietly for the rest of his life in the outskirts of Philadelphia, surviving off an annuity provided by Robert's old deputy Superintendent of Finance and personal friend, Governor Morris. Again, no relation. Robert Morris died from complications of asthma on May 8, 1806. There were no public events to commemorate his life. So why has the country he fought to create largely forgotten him? Rapoli says it's because he was too rich to be a folk hero, and the ultimate failure of his personal fortune robbed him of any mystique. While I agree with this sentiment, we also need to remember that being a financier isn't as glamorous as being a military hero in the public imagination. What should his legacy be then? How should we remember Robert Morris, the financier? Though filled with uncertainty and doubt, he nevertheless risked his own fortune and his very life to support a cause he initially believed was hopeless. He battled external and internal enemies, continually attempting to provide Congress with the financial backing they needed to wage war. Even though many of his economic reforms did not come to pass, he does not bear the blame. The Confederation system stymied his every move. The difficulties Morris faced when trying to raise funds for the Continental Army helped crystallize a growing sentiment among many leading Americans that the new nation needed a stronger federal government, leading to the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, the world's longest surviving charter of government. And many of the reforms he attempted during the war would later be introduced by his successor, Hamilton. Many of those reforms, such as a national bank, we take for granted today. And the rise and fall of his personal fortune, while perhaps making his legacy less appealing, nonetheless encapsulates the boom and bust so integral in our laissez-faire capitalist system, even though we tend to forget the busts to help us sleep at night. But we are all fallible, for better or for worse. His public and personal life have had a profound impact on shaping our political and economic reality. I hope you found this video both informative and exciting. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Join us next time as we look at our next forgotten figure, the female Paul Revere, Sybil Ludington.